when we focus entirely on the end goal and our hearts move to ownership, this is what happens. We get frustrated and we get burnt out, and we get to the place where we wonder if what we're doing really, really matters, because our own end goal becomes so important to us that if we don't get there, we feel like quitting constantly. And we've got to get to a place to where we go, okay, if it's a stewardship and if Jesus is really in control of this, then even if I don't, quote unquote, see the desired end goal, my job in the season is just to move everything I can towards that end goal, regardless of how long I get to stay or not stay. Hey, Mark, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dave. Sitting in your backyard on your phone, back in the same spot.
Yeah, we're not at Popeyes or Casey's this morning, so we're a little bit more professional, right?
Yeah, it's almost like we know what we're doing. Praise God.
We've been kicking around the idea of what it looks like to move the needle as leaders, and the relationship between the small steps that we take in moving it versus getting to the end goal. And what is the relationship between the final, like our final goal, what we'd really like to see happen, and then all of the process that comes and the tension in between those. So what do you say we kick that around today?
I'd love to do it. Yeah, that's great.
Perfect. Well, welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where we discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. I'm Dave Miller, and I'm here with my co-host, Mark Gearing, hanging out in New York, and I'm hanging out in Oklahoma City. And we're glad that you guys could join us today.
Amen. Dave, as you kick us off of this topic, we've used this phrase, the CFC, before. Can you tee that up? What is the CFC again, and how does that connect to this topic?
So probably the most difficult issue in getting work done in a city and to really make progress towards no place left, even in our local areas, is this idea of CFC, which is consistency. It's actually commitment, focus, and consistency. It's the idea that we figure out where our calling is. What is it that God's put in our heart, or what we just want to do to get started, what we see needs to be done, and we commit to that, and we take ownership of it. Not owner in the sense of I'm in charge of everything, but stewardship. The idea of we're responsible. We're taking the responsibility for something. And once we do that, we get commitment. We got to focus in. So it means we have to clear other things off of our plate, which means our no list is probably most important in our life, because our yes list gets very small, where we're focused in and we're saying, there's only so many things I can do. And so I'm going to do the things that matter most. And that means that there's going to be a lot of things I have to say no to that could be good. And some of them could even be very, very important. And then last is consistency. This idea that once I'm committed and once I'm focused, that week in and week out, day after day, month after month, year after year, if necessary, I continue to stay in that committed, focused area of work until I see breakthrough in what God wants to do.
You were kicking around this topic and this idea that is not necessarily communicating in saying commitment, focus, consistency, that as leaders that are trying to develop that means that your job is to take it across the finish line. Unpack a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. The finish line is usually pretty far off. So if I'm going to say, okay, we have Arabic speaking North Africans, and there's a group of them in Oklahoma City, we could break it down into smaller groups. But let's say Arabic speaking North Africans that live in Oklahoma City becomes something that I get a CFC for. I'm committed to that. I get focused on that. And then I consistently start to work towards that. I would say personally, if I was to say that's my CFC, my end goal would to see 2 to 3 churches that were led by Arabic-speaking North Africans who have come to Christ, come out of the harvest, or even new believers who come into town in whatever way God brings them into our world, and that those churches are being led, gathering together, and they are moving towards and have reproduced, right? So you have an indigenous-led reproducing church here in Oklahoma City among that particular group or segment that I would focus in on in my CFC. Okay, if that's my end goal that's there are so many steps that are in the process of that. Right. And sometimes we think, oh, man, if I could just have that happen in 3 or 4 months. But in my experience so far, it's not going to happen in 3 or 4 months. It's going to be some years of work. to get there. So what do we do in the meantime whenever we haven't reached that end goal? And what happens if that end goal is something we never reach, but we're only a part of getting it started and we have to move on, or we have to understand how to get other people involved in case we have to move out or get taken out of the work?
So it's an important piece of the CFC, but at some point passing it off or stewarding for that season as a mindset is pretty key. You use that word a lot, the stewarding piece. What do you mean by stewarding versus owning? Can you unpack that piece?
Well, yeah, I think that's super important in this conversation, Mark, because ownership is something that I control. In other words, the strategy, the tools, maybe the training, maybe the people, maybe those things become something that I own. And I'll know in my heart if I've moved towards ownership away from stewardship, if two real big warning signs will come about. One is if someone sees success in an area that I feel like I own, if I have jealousy instead of joy because of that, then I have moved from stewardship to ownership. Another one that will really show that I've moved from stewardship to ownership is if someone wants to try or wants to do something outside of my control. In other words, someone else that I find out is working and I try to tell them what they should or shouldn't do, I've moved from stewardship to ownership. So stewardship is coming back and saying, no, strategy is Jesus' strategy. The work is Jesus' work. The kingdom is Jesus' kingdom. And I am just simply someone who is doing the work of Christ. And if I'm a steward of that, then that means that the true CFC is something that the Lord has given me as something he's entrusted, a responsibility he's entrusted to me, which means my job is just to do what he asks. And that, I think, Mark, is super helpful, because when we focus entirely on the end goal and our hearts move to ownership, this is what happens. We get frustrated and we get burnt out, and we get to the place where we wonder if what we're doing really, really matters, because our own end goal becomes so important to us that if we don't get there, we feel like quitting constantly. And we've got to get to a place to where we go, okay, if it's a stewardship and if Jesus is really in control of this, then even if I don't, quote unquote, see the desired end goal, my job in the season is just to move everything I can towards that end goal, regardless of how long I get to stay or not stay. And I think that allows us to do that old Jim Elliott quote, right? Whatever you believe to be the will of God, be all there. Live to the hilt every single situation you believe to be the will of God. I think that allows us to be all in every season without worrying about, am I wasting my time or will I ever get to where I think I should go? No, it's about moving the needle and giving our all towards the bigger picture. That contribution conversation, it's coming back up again.
It's coming back up again. Yeah. As we've been trying to steward well here in New York and working together with a team, an emerging team of teams, that idea we've been kicking around even in recent episodes here, the idea of a muddy boots role. What does it look like to be in the work and be engaged in such a way that you are tangibly moving the work from one place to a measurable another place, in the trenches as a part of the making disciples, planting churches, raising up leaders. And I feel like that is a helpful way that it's helped me to engage with what you're talking about, Dave, because if there's not, I like the phrase milestones, that if we're not identifying milestones in the work, where like if you're taking a hike and you just are focused on the end goal, just focused on where you're trying to get to, it can be daunting and it can be hard to grasp how do you get meaningful progress where you are. But if you have milestones where it's like, I'm going to get to this point, and you see a mile marker along the side, it helps you to see progress. And so maybe you could dig into that piece a little bit too. What does it look like to live in that tension where you're stewarding and you're stewarding a segment, a piece of the work, but also having muddy boots where you're engaging with aiming towards meaningful progress and having enough ownership that you're actually making a dent in it?
Well, you recently reintroduced me to the 4 Disciplines of Execution book. And as you were putting together and working on simplifying the idea of how do we take the 7 phases, which we've talked about a lot on earlier podcasts, as a way to track and to keep up with where are we in our progress of work. I think what you did, Mark, is you set up some milestones, right? So we have adoption as a milestone. We have gospeling as a milestone. We have believers now as a milestone. We have a church as a milestone. We have leaders, reproducing leaders. Then we have reproducing churches. Like, these are simple little milestones that will help us understand we're moving down the road and we're progressing the way that we should, which gives us wins. And a culture, in order for a culture to have joy in the journey, and for a culture of people to find unity and purpose in what they're doing, they have to have things as a people to celebrate, because what you celebrate is what you become, right? So if I go back to that 4DX book, 4 Disciplines of Execution, you had taken some of those 4 pieces and you had adapted those into a way to talk about how we set up what our high value activities are. In other words, what are our rhythms? What are we doing week in and week out that are going to help us move from adoption to gospeling to believers to church? That we say, here's my stewardships right now in this season. I think one principle that I would bring up out of that particular book that I think was helpful was the difference between the wildly important goal and what they called the whirlwind. So going back to your question, the whirlwind is everything you're always having to do all the time to make sure that life happens and ministry happens. So if we were to take the 4 fields illustration of the seed sower, entry, gospeling, discipleship, church formation, leadership development, and then reproducing all of that, we're always going to be doing all of them. In the good old Chuck Wood illustration, where he used to pick up the piece of paper and he'd crumple it up and he'd say, how does this happen? And it's not in linear fashion. It doesn't go in consecutive order. It is all happening at the same time. That's the whirlwind when it comes to ministry. And inside of that, we've also got family. So we've also got work. We've also got unexpected events and emergencies and bills to pay and places to go and subways we have to ride or cars we have to drive. Like, there's the whirlwind. It's just the stuff of life that always has to happen. And dogs barking. Sometimes that happens too.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. And then inside of that, we have to have a wildly important goal that becomes what we believe and understand to be the most important thing to focus on while we're still doing the whirlwind. And I think one of the most helpful things to talk about in this conversation is, if we want to move the needle towards the end goal, we've got to understand that the whirlwind has to be happening at all times. We don't stop 4 fields just to focus in on adoption. In other words, I'll get real super practical. If I'm in adoption phase and I'm just trying to figure out where the people are, and I'm out on the streets walking around where Google tells me some of my focus group segment should be. Okay. Right. And I meet one of them. And in that moment I go, I'm not in gospeling phase yet. I'm not going to gospel. Right. Well, that's replacing the wildly important goal, which is the research in this season, to the exclusion of the whirlwind, which is I should be a gospeling Christian at all times. Yeah. Right. And so both of them have to happen simultaneously. And so when we're working on these things, we're saying, yeah, there's still life. Everything's still going. We don't replace all of the regular things and the regular habits, church waffle, if you will, those regular 12 habits of a Christian. We don't set those aside because we have a specific goal that we're after. We're saying we're living out those core mandates of a Christian while we say, I'm going to emphasize all of those things on this particular area to move the needle to the next step and the next step and the next step. And I still have to be training people on all the whirlwind things. Right. While I'm also focusing in on the wildly important goal. And I think that is probably one of the hardest balances and tensions to keep without getting burned out, because we tend to go one way or the other. We tend to go all focused goal or all focused whirlwind. Right. And that balance between the two is difficult. Just to use the language of the 4DX book, it's just a way of illustrating this concept.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Dave. And so that gives that SC a way to identify what to focus on, and then how to track that, and how to hammer away at that within that target, that segment. And so even for me, that begins to help to talk about that pull of the tension between, there is some, maybe ownership's not the word, but there's some level of a kind of stewardship that's actually moving the needle versus just talking about the strategy or the segment, the needs of it without actually moving things forward. So there's that piece of it. But then the other end of that tension of keeping my heart in the place of stewardship, I think, is wig take, where the segment that I'm stewarding, the piece of it that I'm a part of helping to steward within the larger vision, is big enough that it requires me to think beyond myself. And so to what you're bringing in, Dave, there can be this tendency towards like getting your hands on something so tight and owning it. And even within the whirlwind, trying to develop those pieces, that you then are unable to accept contribution from other people. And my experience has been the openness of that contribution happens when I keep my eyes on a target that's big enough. There's absolutely no way that I, and even those on the team that I'm working with, can accomplish it on our own. So how has that looked for you in terms of just the keeping your eyes on or making sure to stay connected to a piece of the pie that's big enough that it forces you into the what's it going to take mentality?
Well, I think two ways. One of them is always looking and meeting people where they are in terms of training. In other words, what's the next step that the person in front of me needs to take to get engaged in mission, either at all or gospeling, or maybe church planting, or even a focus, like they're at the place where they're ready to take a focus group. And I think the bigger picture, the focus on the whirlwind of all these things, believers, every believer that I engage and every believer that I come in contact with, that the Lord gives me an opportunity to have a more, crucial conversation with them. Not every person I run into is going to be this way, but whenever I have the opportunity to have a crucial conversation, the bigger picture allows me to say to them, where are you and how can I help you take the next step? And then if they say, what does that look like for you? Well, then I can step back and say, in this season and what I'm focused doing, here are the wildly important goals, to use that language. Here are my focused rhythms that I'm doing right now for what I personally am contributing as part of everything that we're doing. And so you made the phrase earlier where you like the idea that you need to be doing what only you can do. Right. I think if you'll unpack that idea, we can then plug that into to say, how do we find out not only what should we be doing that only we can do, but then when we engage with other believers, helping them figure out what only they can do, and then catalyzing that in their life as well.
Yeah. To me, that phrase, and I'll see if this lines up with how you think about that, Dave, but to me, that means you've got to have crystal clarity of the end state that you're moving towards. And then it really brings it into that muddy boot idea that you can have crystal clarity on the end state, but the idea of only doing what only you can do really requires you to have an understanding of those steps along the way to get there. And then looking around and saying, so you've got clarity at the end state, clarity of the steps along the way. Now you got to look around and say, what resources are already there? Not just resources in terms of money or physical resources, but people as well. So you're able to look around and say, are there already church planters that are engaging Nepali believers or the lost Nepali people here? Then I want to go and work with them, because that's a piece of the step towards the end state of seeing reproducing Nepali churches, so that I can move on to somewhere else. So I've got to look around and see what the resources are available, and then I'm only going to do what only I can do. So within the context of the steps to get to that end state and the resources available, I'm going to help step in. There's a need there to move things towards the next stage of the work. I'm going to step into that role rather than trying to go out and being a seed sower. If there's already some believers or there's already church planters there, then it wouldn't make sense for me to step in and go back farther in the phases of progress and start back here. No, I'm going to try to step into where things already are moving and help move them forward.
And to set up the context, you and I are talking about, we're looking for how do we impact the gaps. And so
Right.
one of the underlying parts of the conversation of you and I, when we're on this podcast, is always going to be we know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, what you and I are always going to be about is, where is the gospel not, and how do we fill the gap to get it there? We can't fill every gap, but if there's a gap that's already been filled, we can look at that and say, praise God for that. Now we're going to step into a place that isn't. Now, every person who might be listening to this podcast may not be wired that way, and that may not be exactly what they're wanting to do. And so there may be some differences in the way where you're stepping in. And let's say that there's a church that's already established and they're struggling with, how do we grow in discipleship as a church body and move together, and you're more pastorally or teacher oriented, and you find yourself in an apostolic conversation. You're going, well, how do I fit in? Well, you can find that gap very quickly, right? But in terms of our conversation, Mark, you're saying, when I see work that hasn't been done yet, I'm going to go to the next step where it needs to be, and it's not, because that's where my heart is. That's where I want to go.
Yeah. I think so. And I would say, even if you aren't thinking that way in terms of gaps, that Jesus, he pretty clearly came to give away the ministry, no matter what kind of ministry.
Right.
And there's this concept of the priesthood of the believer, that all the way back to Moses, God's trying to make a kingdom of priests, but they want somebody in between. I mean, that's the story of the Bible, is everybody's always trying to give away their authority. And so I think that idea of only do what only you can do should apply to everybody, that we're always trying to be open-handed with whatever we have and raise up others to be able to do it and give it away.
I think if you have that mentality of, I will do only what I can do, then you constantly also have to say, I can't do everything.
Right.
The only reason you begin to think that way, the only reason you would think that way, is because you have come to terms with the reality that I'm a steward. I can't do everything. I must contribute something, and I've got to trust my Lord and my fellow coworkers to do the things that I can't.
That's true.
And whenever you get that, then to say, I'll only do what I can do, makes total sense, because you're saying there's so much that can be done. And to go back to your original question that you asked me, one of the main ways you keep that tension between the work that still needs to be done versus my CFC and what only I can contribute, or my wildly important goal and my daily rich habits and activities and weekly things, that right there is one of the main ones. There's so much that needs to be done. There's no possible way I can do that all, which always, always, always brings us back to why we do this podcast. I therefore must multiply myself.
Right.
We have to multiply leaders in order to increase the work. We have to exponentially multiply leaders, and we cannot put a timeline on that. We have to make sure that we keep a needle moving on that, because if we look at everything that needs to be done, and we constantly don't ever celebrate the small wins of the needle move, then we're just going to get overwhelmed, and we're going to say there's no point in what I'm doing anyway. But we got to get back to the place where we go, I can't do everything. I can only do something. The Edward Hell quote, I'm only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. What I can do, I should do. And what I should do, by the grace of God, I will do. I will. Right. That's the concept. And that is a stewardship mindset.
There's some really good pieces in this conversation that I think we don't talk about often enough in the world that most of the people who listen to this are probably in the movement world, where I think we often talk about big vision, and we can see this stewardship from Jesus, the Great Commission, if you want to go there, or Acts 1:8, or Matthew 24:14, Revelation 7:9. There's these different places that we go to talk about the Father's heart for the nations and the end state of all of this. And we can even grab a hold of that idea of multiplication as we begin to dig through and see that that's actually God's strategy from Genesis to Revelation and those pieces. But it seems like oftentimes people are either holding on to that big end vision, or they're really close to the work, and they're just seeing the person in front of them. There's an art maybe to that, of being able to see the end state and keep holding on to, keep your heart engaged with the end state, the lostness, the need that is still before us, while also, like you said, being engaged with the people in front of us, actually moving things forward and celebrating so that that gap begins to close over time. I don't know a lot of people that live in that tension well and are able to help lead a team in the middle of that. So I don't know could you speak to that a little bit, Dave, of what does that look like to live in that?
To be honest with you, Mark, I'll put you on the spot, not today, but in a future podcast. I really do think we need to go through kind of where your heart and your thinking is on some of the iron on iron pieces that you've got coming up soon.
Yeah.
The way in which you laid out how to explain the way you're thinking about such a large task as the 5 places in Queens, and how each of those spaces represents 500,000 people, right?
Yeah.
Give or take. Okay, that's enormous. And then to use the language that you use, how do I campaign while I focus? And I think that tension is found really well in the way in which you're describing. How do we talk about and campaign what needs to be done while we're showing people how we're contributing specifically, and knowing that at all times we're campaigning and talking. And to tie that in, I think the real connecting piece that I gained from you basically when I read through, some of the stuff you're going to be doing for your iron on iron.
Yeah.
The tracking piece has become so important.
Yes.
To that conversation, because if I can show other people where I am and I can see where other people are, and we have a common way of tracking and a common language that is broad enough for many people to be involved, but narrow enough for us to know that we're moving in the same direction. That one piece, I think, allows a community to know how I am contributing and we're contributing together. And even if I don't have something that's a massive celebration, someone in my community will have one and we can celebrate together. So I think the irony is that the CFC as individuals inside of a community of practice, tracking each of our own CFCs as a unit, saying this is what we're working towards as a bigger vision that no one can do alone, and we're doing it together, actually is what allows that tension to be something that's a joy and not a burden.
I've just been seeing how much tracking, which we made a podcast episode about getting a F in tracking, however long ago that was. I'm not sure if I'm much higher than a D or a C, but I'm a little
We're
bit. We're
definitely seeing the value of it way more than we did before.
Seeing the value of it, and seeing the value of the tracking in terms of quantity, but also anecdotally. And so as we've been, I think this still connects with our episode today, but as we've been campaigning, networking, sharing with other leaders we're talking with in the city, we live in a place where the whirlwind is insane. The level of just the daily life. Yeah. Yeah. I told somebody when we were visiting, I was like, you may not feel it while you're here, but I just call this city the city of 1,000 paper cuts. It's like there's no one thing that takes you out here. It's just paper cut, paper cut, paper cut, paper cut. And it just builds up over time to where you're weary. And so anyway, we were meeting with a couple of different leaders that were talking about what we're doing, trying to vision cast to them. And it's almost like they can't even hear us is almost what it felt like. Cause it's like, there's so many people with another strategy, another good idea that just gets taken out by the whirlwind in a place like this. Strategies are a dime a dozen. They're not even interested in hearing about it. But when I pulled my phone out and I said, hey, here's a photo of a gathering that's happening this week. Swipe, here's a photo of one of those disciples. Swipe, here's a photo of that disciple sharing the gospel with this person. Here's that disciple, that new disciple that they led to Christ. They're like, oh, yeah, tell me more about that. Because it's the tracking piece of what's actually happening in the CFC that got their attention to be able to talk about what's happening in their particular segment or area. And so I think those two pieces of the CFC, while campaigning, stewarding the big picture, I just more and more, I see them as inseparable. And keeping my heart in that place, which is the topic of this episode, of the stewardship versus just holding on to it. It's a dance, it's a tension, but if we can live in it, it makes it possible to spread around the hot coals and help to get new things started.
And honestly, Mark, I think that from a Western perspective, especially because of the way that I don't mean to get too philosophical here, but to simply say it, the way that we're educated is we're taught to get information, spill it on a test, forget it, and move on. There's
Right.
no actual, okay, how are you practically going to implement? How are you going to take this knowledge and then turn it into a rhythm of life and habits that are going to make a difference?
Right.
That is not a clue. I mean, my sister teaches math, and she gets so mad whenever people say all the time, well, what does this got to do with real life? And the answer is, well, it's because we have a really hard time with the way that we're taught on what do I even do with this on an everyday basis. And so
Right.
as a practical example, I have employees that can make an A in calculus but can't count change for the drawers at our business. Okay. The reason I bring that up is to say I have found that the hardest barrier to cross is when you sit down with somebody and say, okay, you've got the 4 fields paradigm, you've got how to share the gospel, you're out practicing, you're active, you're busy. All of those things are good things. Now, how can you hone that, focus it, and track it? What do you need to do next in order to engage a particular segment? I'm all about broad seed sowing, but whenever you get to the place where you say, okay, if you're in the gospeling phase, what are 3 high value activities, habits that you ought to be doing week in and week out that are going to make a difference for you to get to the next step? And to have somebody make that specific of a decision, it causes smoke to start pouring out of their ears and their little blue wheel starts spinning. And honestly, Mark, it is very hard for people to go practically, this is the thing or 2 or 3 that I should be doing that matter most in this season, because the overwhelmingness is easy. The vagueness is easy. It's the simple that's hard, right? But not just simple, but targeted simple. That's actually a very hard thing to do. And I watch as we start to go, what are the habits you ought to be doing week in and week out and where you are in season of work? And I'm watching young leaders that is one of the hardest things for them to learn to do.
That's good. I was talking with a leader who has been very effective at executing and seeing some things reproduce and multiply. And their take on that was, this was in the context of putting together a 4 fields plan. So for our podcast listeners, that's a part of what we do when we're training leaders, disciples, especially as a part of what we call a 4 fields intensive, or we're really helping them grab a hold of the big picture. That they want to come away with a plan of how do you actually implement this. And so, but his perspective on that was, if I'm going to sit down with somebody and help them develop that plan, I want to have 90% of the time, 90% of that time spent digging into and unpacking the challenge, the problem that they're facing, and only a small percentage of that time coming up with the solutions and the game plan of what they're going to do. And I think that was a really helpful, simple way of saying that, because when you say that, Dave, of it's hard to come up with the simple things, I think it's usually because we don't have enough understanding of the problem itself. We haven't sat down, we haven't learned from others, we haven't put in the time that it takes to understand well enough, for example, what it looks like to get from church to reproducing church, to understand the particular dynamics of the context we're in and just how that works generally as a principle. We haven't dug into that enough to be able to say these 3 things will move the needle. And so that's a discipline I've been trying to lean into, and then help some guys I'm working with begin to lean into, of let's really just pour over this challenge enough until you can really begin to see that clear enough to say these are the things that will move the needle on that.
Yeah, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I would say that as people get started, sometimes our encouragement to them is just throw mud at the wall and get started trying,
right?
Because we're so focused in that season on just getting them some reps so that they can get comfortable with even doing it to begin with.
Yes.
That it's sometimes, I think, maybe is difficult for them to then make the transition, that we go, okay, once you've got the reps in and you know what you're doing, now let's back up, ask problem solving questions, and stop just getting reps in, and let's get strategic and start doing principle-based learning on how do we now tailor this. A perfect example was I was at a Iron on Iron one time. Somebody got up and said, I think we shared the 3 circles about 3,000 times. no one has listened yet. No one's repented and believed, but just keep sharing it. And one of these days, God's going to come through. And a very seasoned leader was sitting next to me, and he leaned over, and he's a gentleman in his 60s, and he leaned over and he goes, maybe they should consider using something other than the 3 circles and see how it works.
Right.
That was the little shift that you just talked about, was something that just hadn't quite happened yet.
Right.
And that's something that has to happen for leaders to take that next step.
That's really good, Dave, to bring in that counterpoint, because there's a dynamic to which when you're trying to find those 3 things that causes the smoke to come out of your ears, for a lot of us, it's starting with best practices, what's already working, and that'll help us to even just get in there enough to begin to see and understand the problems well enough, maybe even intuitively, principally, to begin to tackle it. So there's that dynamic too of just go for it and do it. But then at some point you've got to say, this isn't working. What do I shift? And so anyway, I appreciate this episode today, because I feel like there's a lot of, we're always kind of hammering away at the tensions, but there's a lot of tension.
Radical middle.
Here. Oh, we are. Yeah. But I don't think it's something you can run from. I think, quite honestly, to engage in this work, there's a reason why a lot of guys I'm talking to are disheartened, frustrated. I get disheartened. I get to a place of being frustrated. It's because we've got to constantly lean into that tension of holding on to the end vision, end state, but also progress right now and all those pieces. So I think just even this day, this has been a good reminder for me of the tension between the two. Yeah,
it's been a good conversation. And I also think that the tensions are there on purpose, because they allow us to continually get pulled so we don't swing the pendulum too far. And if we do swing the pendulum too far, it won't be very long before that tension pulls us back in the direction that we need to have. I would love, Mark, to be the perfect leader that kept all these things in perfect balance at all times. But gosh, it is a good reminder. This is why we stay tightly abiding in our Lord and listening to his word and his directions. And sometimes the things that he tells us to do seem really off the wall, but then after we do it, we're like, oh, yeah, that made total sense. I just was so, tunnel visioned into something else that you needed me to do that. And he can use his word. He can use other brothers and sisters and coworkers in Christ. He can use, circumstances, situations, all those kind of things to get our attention and to say, hey, get out of that tunnel. I need you to look at it from a different perspective again. But I guess this is the journey of raising up leaders. How do we move the needle? And this is a needle moving conversation, because every single one of these little steps that we take is what's going to move us towards the bigger vision that we're after.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.